Thank you very much. I want to place my presentation within the context of an evolving African state, an evolving continent. And I want to make the point that the African state finds itself subject to certain linear movements at three dimensions. The first dimension, which I think we devoted a lot of time on Monday and Tuesday in the first 2 days, concerns the internal dimension, the sovereign dimension, what happens inside that nation state. And we located yesterday intra-state issues and activities that are a threat to security. We discussed issues around corruption. We discussed issues around the rule of law. We discussed issues around contested elections. We discussed issues around religious radicalization. We discussed issues around ineffective states, state failure, and fragility. We discussed issues around inequality. We discussed issues such as kamikaze bombings that we are witnessing in certain parts of Africa around, connected around terrorism, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab. So those are internal issues. But within the internal issue, the evolving African state faces regional challenges because we live in interconnected regions, the SADC region, the East African region, the West African region, the MENA region. And within these regional groupings, there are implosions and explosions that are affecting the interconnected national state. So when there is a disturbance in Burkina Faso, it affects the region. When there is a struggle of contested elections in Côte d'Ivoire, it affects the region. When there is a contested election in Kenya, it affects the region around it. So regional developments become part of the multiplier players on the evolving African state. Then there's the third issue, the international sphere, the international matrix. And in the international matrix, there are a number of things that are happening, which the African policymaker, which the African decision maker cannot remain oblivious to, cannot remain disinterested. They play a major role and aspect in his or her decision-making processes. And the regrettable thing is that the further the issue demarcates itself from national boundaries, the limited capacity the African policymaker has of controlling the issue. So the more issues evolve outside the domestic boundaries, the less capacity we have as African policymakers of controlling that process. So for instance, we are living in an age of technology, and technology is evolving every day. To all of us Africans, to the majority of us Africans, we are the beneficiaries, we are the consumers of this technology. We have no control over it. So while it's within our fears, we can control students demonstrating at a university, women demonstrating at a market in one of our overcrowded cities. The exogenous factors we have little control of. And what we can do is to try and mitigate them. And I'm going to propose at the end of my presentation that the only way that we can shield ourselves, the only ways that we can create buffers against these external shocks is by creating an effective state. And an effective state is one that is functional rule of law, functional constitutionalism, strong institutions, strong markets, inclusive economies, growing economies, but growing economies that are also inclusive. That's the only way we can create this buffer against the cyclical exogenous factors. I want to speak to some of the external challenges that are key to our continent. I want to start with the issue of our economies. Our economies are so integrated in the global economic matrix. And many of our countries were created from the Berlin Conference of 1884. Many of our countries have gone through a period of colonialism. And the key motivation of colonialism was to extract resources from our countries, raw commodities. So our economies are therefore inextricably linked to the metropole because we've been traditionally providers of raw resources, raw commodities such as minerals, platinum, gold, iron, chrome, raw commodities in the form of agricultural goods, cocoa in West Africa, cotton, maize, and so forth. So what happens is that because we have failed to alter this accumulation model between the time that the settler colonialists came into our countries to now, we still remain linked to this umbilical cord. When there is a commodity boom, it has helped us. We have enjoyed and reaped the results of that commodity boom. But in the main, commodity booms have been a fiction. And so if you trace the history of the African state from the time of independence in the 60s, you actually see how cyclical our growth is and how it has been linked to these commodity slumps and booms. And I dictate three phases of the growth of the African economy. The period from 1960 to 1974, where because of excitement around independence, we saw modest growth and our per capita income was on average US $943. Then we went the period from 1974 to 1994, a period of massive decline, a period in which we saw a 32% decline in our per capita income to US $732. Then from 2007 to 2013, there's been an increase up to US $1,108 in respect of our per capita income. Now we've entered another phase, the period of slump in global commodities, which is now wreaking havoc against and in African continents. And one of the things that the current commodity slump has done is to unmask the myth behind the Africa Rising theory that was being paraded a lot in the last 2-3 years. I make reference to the McKinsey report of 2010. I make reference to the African Development Bank report, the report commissioned by Donald Kaberuka during the same period, preaching the gospel of Africa rising. And I make reference to the massive literature around this subject. But what has happened in the past 2 years, 2015, 2016, is to unmask that theory and has been to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt how vulnerable our economies are to the external shock of the variable commodity prices. Even in those countries which appear to be doing so well, Nigeria, Angola, where they were reaping the results of the increase in the price of hydrocarbons, we did not create sufficient fiscal buffers to protect ourselves against the current challenge. Nor did we sufficiently diversify our economies so that we were able to graduate from sole dependence on these mono economies based on diamonds, economies based on on fuels and so forth. So my submission is that African economies, unless we're able to create alternative accumulation models that help us graduate from the traditional point of entry of capital into Africa, which is raw commodities, will continue to be arrested by the changes in the international infrastructure of the world economy. And one of the things that is going to affect us in the mid-term to long-term is the rebalancing of the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is going through its own internal processes of rebalancing, a shift from an export-led growth to, for the first time, looking after its own domestic consumption, and the transformation of its industries from external export-led industries to internal consumer-facing industries. And that is going to have a huge impact on African economies that for the past 10 years have been feeding a lot from Chinese capital. Another growing threat that is coming is the growth of the re-emergence of domestic African debt. Many African countries after 2004 went through various multilateral debt relief initiatives. The common one was YIPIC. Many of you went through various Paris Club negotiations, either on the Cologne terms or on the Nepal terms or on the Evian terms. And a lot of African countries actually brought our debt to sustainable levels. But during the time of the commodity boom, debt is like a drug. Debt is like a drug. If you don't manage it, you go back to it. And during the time of the commodity boom, a lot of our governments went to international financial markets and borrowed. We issued international bonds. In the case of Zambia, they wanted 700 million. The paper was oversubscribed by over 15 times, 20 times. There were $11 billion on offer. Mozambique, Rwanda, Ghana, Uganda, all these countries went on international markets to borrow. Nigeria to borrow. Now, with the collapse of the current commodity boom, chickens have come home to roost. And this is private international borrowings. Unlike the borrowings, the debt up to 2004, which was largely located in London Club Group of Creditors, Paris Club Group of Creditors, or the IFIs, in particular, the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Bank, this new current level of debt threat has got two components. He has got traditional developmental debt owed to the World Bank, owed to the African Development Bank, and owed to the IMF in respect of balance of payment support. But it has got the new, what I call, for a lack of a better word, excitement debt. The debt accruing from private international markets through the instrumentality of bonds, many of which were secured by very vicious terms. Many of these bonds were rushed through parliaments, sleeping legislatures, without full details of the extent of the securities required, not fully disclosed to legislatures. Now there's now default. There's now default because our currencies are collapsing. And many of us African governments are now making the mistakes of trying to prop up artificially those currencies when we don't have the reserves, or are ending up eating up those reserves. So the point of what I'm saying is that we have another threat, another emerging threat on the African continent at the present moment, which is the threat of debt. So if you look at the figures of a country like Cabo Verde, Mozambique, Zambia, Ghana, even South Africa, the debt sustainability levels have gone haywire. The ratio of the net present value of exports to debt, net present value of revenue to debt has reached unsustainable levels. So we've gone back to square zero. So I see that as a threat. But another threat which Philip has spoken about, and this to me is the real bomb, the population levels. Population growth per se is not a threat to any economy. I think basic economics now understands that. But population growth rate becomes a threat if state capacity to meet that increase in the population growth rates is not there. And herein lies the challenge to Africa. By 2050, there will be an extra 1.2, 1.4 billion citizens on the African continent. So at this rate, we have to create between 40% to 50% jobs than we are creating right now. That means on average, the continent must, with up to 2050, create at least 100 to 150 million jobs, but we are not doing that. And the frightening thing about this demographics is that it's a young population. It's a young population. Currently, there are over 300 million people on the African continent that are below the age of 35. And so one of the frightening things that is happening now is that we are now creating generations. The first two decades of independence were terrible. I consider them wasted decades. But there were the periods in respect of which the African continent was as close to full employment as possible. Now, in places like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, we are creating decades of citizens, 2-3 generations of citizens, young people who have never had the honor and privilege of actually being employed in a formal job. And many of these are graduates from our universities. Now, this population is dangerous. I call it the iPad generation. They are dangerous because they are educated. They are dangerous because they are well connected, and technology is doing amazing things. Technology is doing amazing things. In 2000, the world population using mobile phones was about 11.1 million. Now in 2015-2016, you're talking of 4 billion people. So you've got this super generation, iPad generation, which is not employed and which cannot be absorbed by domestic economies. So the population challenge juxtaposed with the burgeoning challenge of youth unemployment becomes a major challenge. Philip has also spoken about urbanization. Where does this population actually reside? The estimates from experts is that by 2050, 56% of the African population will be living in major cities. Now, those of you who have been to places like Luanda, places like Kinshasa, places like Freetown, places like Monrovia, will testify to the challenges, the huge challenges of a huge influx of a population that is migrating to our cities. So if you go to Kinshasa, the population of Kinshasa is over 15 million. It's the same as Luanda. But these cities don't have the infrastructure to cater for this population. So if I go back to my own country, the infrastructure that is in Harare in terms of water, electricity, was designed for 480,000 white people who were in the metropole before independence. Now Harare alone has got 2 million people. The dormitory towns of Harare, Chitungwiza, Rua, and so forth have got another 2 million people. So most of the time, the citizen doesn't have water. There are children that are growing up in Harare who can see a tap, because it's there on his father's house in the compound. But he doesn't know that this tap is actually supposed to come water, because he hasn't seen water coming out of, that tape. And in many of our countries, the majority of our people, even in urban areas, don't have access to covered water, don't have access to proper ablutions that can be flushed. And all these, to me, are major threats, and major threats that must make us think outside the box and have this vision, as I said at the beginning, of building a sustainable state. I want to talk about another threat, a growing international threat, which no one has spoken about. I think that one of the challenges, international challenges, which we are seeing, which has an impact on the evolving African state, the African conflict, I think, is what I've called in my notes international law that is in retreat. International law is very important. And international law is important in three respects. Number one, you will find in international law bodies and institutions that have helped in responding to crises, the various crises that have evolved on the African continent. So in this regard, the UN is a very important body. Currently, right now, there are more than 13 missions on the African continent, deployed missions on the African continent. Our own regional bodies, as part of international law, are key and important. And here I'm talking of the African Union, for instance. I'm talking of ECOWAS. I'm talking of the REX. I'm talking of SADC. I'm talking of the East African Union. All these are international institutions found in international law that have played a key role in protecting the security of the citizen and the security of nation states in times gone by. Number two is customary international law. Number two is the protocols that we are all signatories, starting, of course, with the most important, the UN Charter of 1948. All these things are important. The third aspect of international law is deterrence. The fear by regimes, domestic regimes, that if I breach certain international standards, there is some sanction or a penalty that I'll pay. And I'm not advocating a gang-hung international policy which involves bombing and liquidating nation states, but I'm talking about the mere existence of that deterrent component. The fear that if I misbehave as a domestic state at international level, there will be a sanction. Now, in my view, these three components, These three components of international law infrastructure are under threat. And because they're under threat, they are also having a multiplier effect on Africa, on the evolving African state. I see, for instance, an overuse of the veto power amongst the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. I see an ineffectiveness in our regional bodies to respond to crisis. I made reference, for instance, yesterday to the crisis that is happening in Burundi right now as I'm speaking. We saw the lack of response of the international community of us Africans to Rwanda in 1994. And in 1 month alone, April 1994, almost 1 million people were killed. I also see a continuous reproduction of the same crisis. Kate yesterday referred to the 2011 World Development Report on conflict. One of the things that conflicts put a premium on the African continent and African countries. For every 5 years that a country is caught up in a conflict, you lose 8 points on your gross domestic product. So I see a retreat, the retreat in international law. I see it as putting a premium on the developmental aspirations of the continent, and hence the continued reproduction of this crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Congo itself, in Somalia, in Eritrea, and I have what I call states in permanent crisis. By states in permanent crisis, I refer to states whose natural default is crisis, is civil war, is a coup, but they have some lull of 5 years to 10 years where people think that's the new normal, but it's not. We go back to our default setting. I don't want to name the countries in that bucket, but their record is self-evident. So these are states where crises keep on replicating, crises keep on reproducing itself. And I locate part of the challenge, part of the problem being the international law in retreat. And it's not just on the African continent. Look at Syria. And part of the problem of international law in retreat is what I'll call, for lack of a better word, the globalization of fragility. Now fragility is no longer an African thing. The refugees that are picking Europe's borders right now, the majority are not coming from the African continent. But of course, they are, as Philip was telling me during the break, there are over 1 million Africans in Libya waiting to find a boat to cross to Europe. So I see this globalization, if you like, of fragility, which thankfully for once is no longer a monopoly of us Africans. So in conclusion, I want to say that I think that let's go back to the vision and strategic leadership, which we have spent discussing in the last 2 days, and let's create a sustainable state founded on strong institutions, founded on the rule of law, founded on democracy. And I want to say that I saw tensions in this room about democracy. I don't think we need to apologize for democracy. I myself don't know of a better system to democracy. It has worked and it can work. The fact that there are bad examples of it and the fact that there has been abuse shouldn't make us surrender from the reality that we do not have an alternative to this creature called democracy, challenged as it is. I thank you very much.